We were in Guatemala that Margaret, our firstborn child, came into the world. The gentleman and his wife had returned to Quetzaltenango from the United States, and we moved down to the coast to San Felipe. It was much warmer in Quetzaltenango. In fact, Quetzaltenango was quite cool, especially at nights, while the low-lying coast was always hot. I was taking trips away from home and sometimes was away for days at a time. Once when I returned, I found Nettie very ill and very weak. In San Felipe, there was no doctor, nor no pharmacy. So one was pretty well left on their own. When Nettie took ill, one of the Christian sisters took upon herself to try and help. However, she must have given her too much castor oil. Castor oil was what she needed, so she was told. But the dose was too much for her, and evidently took a lot out of her strength. So when I came home, I found her in that condition. Then we moved to Guatemala City for the birth of our child. That was indeed the Lord's leadings, although we were much criticized for doing so. It happened that a plane came down and gave Nettie quite a fright as it landed on the ground 2 blocks from where she was. As the time drew near, we went to the American hospital, which was run by the Presbyterian Church. There was a very good Christian doctor there. He examined my wife and thought she was all right. However, when she came in, the doctor thought there was no need to examine her any further. But when the time came, they found out that it was a very, very serious birth. In fact, the doctor approached me and told me there was little or any hope to save the child. It would either be the child or my wife, and I had to make the decision. Fortunately, there was an expert doctor there at the time from the States. It was the Lord's doing, there's no doubt about that. This young man had studied, and he was quite an expert in this. He was visiting Guatemala City, and that very day he should have been on the plane going back to the United States. But the night before, he was so ill with dysentery that it was impossible for him to take the trip. So there he was, and there was no doubt about that. The Lord guided it in such a way that he was there to help the doctor in this very serious case. After a long time, it seemed to be days to me, I was told everything was all right. This young doctor had given a hand. He knew exactly what to do, and our firstborn, Margaret, was born normally. We thank the Lord for that. Now, it took my wife some considerable time to recover, but the Lord had opened up a way for her to stay in Guatemala City with a dear Christian sister there who bestowed much love upon her. She and her husband, by the way, was not a Christian at that time, but he did all in his power to make my wife and newborn babe comfortable. After a few days, I went back again to San Felipe, and while I was there, the volcano Santa Maria erupted. Now I, of course, knew nothing about what was happening until one of the Christians came to our door very late at night, about 11 o'clock. And she told me to get up and get ready to be able to leave San Felipe if it was necessary. That Santa Maria had erupted and the lava was flowing down the mountain. And they did not know whether or not San Felipe would be in danger. But all were advised to get ready to flee. I went up to the housetop, and right enough I could see the volcano in eruption. Now there was a village down below that volcano, and the lava and the water and the mud came down with such a rush that it buried that little village completely. And it came within 10 minutes of our village. However, the authorities had been very careful and had taken note of everything. And the conclusion was that it was not necessary to evacuate. So we got staying in our homes. However, in the morning, the dust from the volcano was 1 inch thick everywhere. And the dust, the volcano dust, got right inside the house. And the house was covered completely, furniture, everything else. In a few days, it was possible to make our way up to the volcano, and we went up and stood in the very place where the village was. Those dear people had not a chance. They were buried alive. It happened to be in All Saints' Day. Now, those dear people were celebrating. And of course, although it was a religious feast, at the same time, it's mixed up with the world in such a way that there are dancing and drinking and all kinds of evil carried on. So those dear people, they were dancing and they were not looking out. The volcano erupted and they knew nothing about it. Some of them ran, some escaped, but very, very few indeed. I think it was about 300 that lost their lives on that night. Now then, as time went on, a gentleman from Honduras came to visit us, Don Alfredo Hawkins. Don Alfredo Hawkins was quite a character. He was for many years a culprit for the American Bible Society. He was a young man living in England where he was brought up. He was very much exercised about the mission field, and he tried to fit himself out for that occupation. He had gone to a medical school and had taken a medical course that's suitable for missionaries. He had also fitted himself out in other ways and was waiting for the Lord to open up a way for him to go to some foreign field. At that time, the American Bible Society needed someone, but could not find anyone in the United States. So they advertised for someone in England. Alfredo saw this notice. He applied, and very soon he was on his way down to Central America. Now, the American Bible Society at that time had their headquarters in Panama Canal. So to Panama Canal, Don Alfredo went. His proper name was Alfredo Hawkins, but down in those countries, you're always called your first name, and they put Don to it, which really means Mr. So Don Alfredo was his name ever after. He spent lots of time traveling all through Central America, Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Colombia, as well as part of Venezuela. Now, he had a mule, and he also had a helper, and he had a mule for himself and a mule for the Bibles. And he would set out with his mule well laden with Bibles. At the same time, Bibles were to be sent to other points on his route. So he very well knew the land. He knew all about each one of these republics. He had spent many times on muleback going through these lands. In fact, there was no other way to travel. Up the mountainside and down the valleys. Sometimes he was in great danger. Sometimes he had everything stolen from him. Other times he was down with malaria and was very ill and at death's door. Other times he was persecuted, he was stoned. And once he had to get out through a small window and hid himself in a tall corn that was growing at that time. He was there with some others until the early morning before he could venture out. He escaped death at many times, and he had many, many adventures and many experiences. Then, afterwards, he returned to England for a time. First of all, he went to Canada by the doctor's orders so that he could have the malaria frozen out of his body. After being in England, he kind of settled down and got married. He brought his young wife out with him and arrived in Honduras and went to the capital, Tegucigalpa. He had then resigned from the American Bible Society and was going to settle down as a missionary. However, he was looking to the Lord to guide him to the proper place. In San Pedro Sula, there was a missionary living along with his wife. But this missionary could not stand the climate any longer. The doctor told him he must get out. So he made arrangements to go, as other missionaries had before him, as that part of Honduras was very, very unhealthy, and no one seemed to be able to live for any length of time. Some had to be carried out in stretchers, and one dear young woman lost her life completely because of the malaria. Yes, there was malaria, there was dysentery and other tropical diseases at that time to contend with. So when Mr. Hawkins heard about this missionary having to leave, he thought that he would try San Pedro Sula. So arrangements were made for Don Alfredo and his wife, Doña Evelina, to go to San Pedro Sula. Now, it was a trip of 2 weeks at that time, because there was no roads. And it was up one mountain and down the valley, along the path, up another mountain and through another valley. Yes, it took them 2 weeks. Along their trip, they almost lost their firstborn child. The baby was born already and was growing up. But it happened to be that they were in a 2-story house for the night, and the child fell from the 2nd story down. Fortunately, she was not injured. They picked her up and were able to go on their way. Now that child is now a young lady, and she too is still living in Honduras as I speak these words in 1981, doing a wonderful work there. They got to San Pedro Sula, arrangements were made, and Don Alfredo took over. At that time, there was very, very little work being done. There were just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 Christians. That was all. The pioneering work had yet to be done, and Don Alfredo was doing his best. He was, of course, a culprit and had not much experience in assembly building. However, he could do other things, and as he had a little medical experience, he was exercised about some sick people. These he was able to help in many ways, and he made a few trips along the coast and was seeing just a little work done, but not very much. About that time, he made a trip to Honduras. I beg your pardon, he made a trip to Guatemala. And, of course, he came to visit us. and we had a very happy time with him indeed. He was very interesting and got us very much interested in Honduras. He told us about the great need there was there, right from the border of Guatemala to the border of Nicaragua. There were no missionaries there of any kind. It was virgin ground. There was a great need. And of course, that was what we were looking for. In fact, we had made up our minds that we were not going to live long in that part of Guatemala. We had thought of going to the great Flattens district. That was a big district that had not been opened up for the gospel. And that was the kind of a place that I had longed to be in. However, Don Alfredo's time came, went very quickly, and soon he had returned to Guatemala. We promised that we would visit him later on. Well, in the meantime, my headaches were so that it was necessary to go home for some time. That was the time that we left and went to Scotland to visit my wife's people. I've already told you about that, and visiting Ireland at the same time. Now from there we went to New York, once more by boat. And there we spent a little time with my aunt there, and a cousin who was also living there at that time. This cousin was a wonderful help, as she knew New York perfectly, and was able to take me on the subway to visit many of the assemblies, where I had the great joy of telling them how the Lord had called me to the work, and how that we had been working in Guatemala. But we're now thinking of going to Honduras. After spending some time then there, we took the train and visited several places as we came on the way to California once more. We visited many of the assemblies on the way and made many good friends. Eventually then, the train was nearing Los Angeles. When we got to Pomona, a strange sight met our eyes. One of the first things I saw was someone with a paper in his hand. And in big letters, I read, John and Nettie returns from Guatemala. It was some of the dear Christians who came out to meet us from Los Angeles. And they were playing the trick on us, making us believe that, well, the authorities had been watching us and seeing what we were doing, and now giving us a welcome home to Honduras. Now, that's one thing that missionaries escape, that some others don't escape. Poor people, I have thought many times, they cannot even move. They can't go from one country to another. The press is on their side, tormenting them with questions and everything. But however, the missionary, for some reason, misses all that. Thanks be to God. So we got to Los Angeles, and I tell you, there was a happy welcome for us there. All the dear Christians couldn't do enough for us, and they had a special welcome home for us. And some dear sisters, especially those in the sisters' missionary class, had made up special poems for us. I don't have one of them at my side now, but perhaps one day I will look them up and read some of them over. Yes, we had a wonderful welcome home. We spent some time there visiting the little assemblies that we had known before we went out to Guatemala. And then, of course, the time came when we were to leave once more. I might say that our family were all intact at that time, and we had a wonderful time with them, enjoying their company. And we had the visiting our sick sister who was in the hospital for so many years. My brother, who had such a time with his back, seemed to be now well cured and was working and helping, and also my other sister who had been ill in Ireland. Now she seemed to be all right and was working too. My father even, who was so weak in Ireland, now seemed to have revived his youth, and he too was busy preaching the gospel in many places around, especially in the tent season, and visiting other dear Christians. But we had to say goodbye at last to those that we were at home and those that we had such a nice time with. We got a wonderful send-off indeed. Now this time we were going to Honduras, direct from Los Angeles. So in this case, we had to go to New Orleans to get the boat. So on the way, we visited more assemblies. We passed through Houston, and we made many good friends there that indeed were friends for years after. We went on to New Orleans. Now in New Orleans in those days, there were not many Christians. In fact, I don't think of any at that time. Later on, yes. But that's where we got the United Fruit boat going down to Honduras. And we had a very nice passage down. And we arrived in Port, let me see now, I just forget the name at the moment, but if I think long enough, I will get it. It was Puerto Cortes. How was it I couldn't get that? Puerto Cortes. Yes, that was the place. Now, Don Alfredo was there to meet us. And, of course, we had to pass through the customs. We got there rather late in the evening, so it wasn't possible for us to get through the customs that night. But one of the head men of the customs was a Christian, and he was a rather famous man. And he allowed us to get off the boat that night and take our hand baggage with us. Now, Don Alfredo had made arrangements for us to stay in a Christian's home in that port. So we went to that home, and what do you know? the whole family of 6 or 7 children had the whooping cough, and they coughed and they coughed and they coughed. Well, our little girl never did have the whooping cough, so she was in danger of being infected. But however, the Lord made it so that she wasn't. She escaped. Now then, we were to be up in the morning very early, and this dear custom man had promised us that he would get our baggage through the customs very early in the morning. Now I might say, down in those countries, early in the morning means about 5 o'clock, as everyone starts to work about 7 o'clock, and the stores are all open about 7:30 or 8 o'clock at the most. So we were down bright and early and found all right the stuff was already off, and we had to get it over to the railroad station, because there was a railroad that went from that port up to San Pedro Sula, and there was no road at that time, only the railroad. So we found our stuff in the railroad station. But before we could get it off and out of the station, we had to buy our tickets first to take us up to San Pedro Sula. So Don Alfredo did his best to get our tickets. Now, we had already taken my wife and little girl and got them seated in the train, and we then went back to wait for the office opening to buy the tickets. So when the office did open to buy the tickets, well, somehow or other there was an argument going on with some of those in the station. And the man that was selling the tickets, it didn't seem to give much interest to the selling of the tickets. He was more interested in arguing with this other man about something. And Don Alfredo tried to attract his attention. Now, it was so you had to buy your ticket before you could get your baggage out and onto the train. So it came to be, Don Alfredo said, I look here, he said to me, I'm afraid we're not going to get away today. You'd better go and get your wife off the train. So I ran back to the train and got my wife and little girl off the train and came back then. And no sooner had we got them off the train when the train left and went off to San Pedro Sula. Now, when we came back to Don Alfredo, the man said, well, that's all right, mañana. There's another train tomorrow. Now, that was all right for him, but for us, well, what were we to do in the meantime? Well, we had our first lesson in mañana. So therefore we couldn't do a thing. So Don Alfredo then, he thought that we had best to go and find out if we could find some other place to sleep and to stay in for that day. Now it was rather hot down there in that port, as it was on the coast, the hot coast, and we had to walk, do a lot of walking. So we walked up there and carried our hand baggage with us, and after about 3/4 of an hour's walk, we got to another Christian's home. And there they very kindly took us in and gave us a place to sleep. And of course they made some food for us, and we were all right there. And we couldn't buy the tickets, of course, until the next morning again. So, of course, bright and early, we were down at the station, and right enough this time, well, the argument was over, whatever it was about. So this ticket vendor, man that sold the tickets, he didn't have anything else to do, so he sold us our tickets. So then we're able to get the baggage out and onto the train. And the train, of course, started off, and on we went. Now we went to Baracoa. Now Baracoa is the central place for many trains to meet. But however, at that time, you got right through to San Pedro. But I'll tell you a little about Baracoa later on. We went right on and got to San Pedro Sula. When we got there, we had to make arrangements to get our baggage up. And of course, there was no taxis there. There was no cars there at that time. And we had to look for a horse, a mule, and wagon. And we got our stuff on there. And eventually we got up to Don Alfredo's home. And the house that he lived in was a house that had been built some time before that. In fact, a long time before that. And there wasn't very much room in it. However, we were given a room to ourselves. And Mrs. Hawkins very kindly made us some food. And we tried to do the best she could for us. But it was very, very plain that there wasn't much to do it with. So fortunately, the Lord had supplied us with some money before leaving the States. And as soon as we got to know the circumstances, we helped them out in that way. However, it was very plain to be seen that they were in very poor circumstances. And we found that their beds weren't really beds. They were an imitation of a bed. They had a bed stocked all right, but there was no mattress. In fact, we found out that underneath the beds they had put their trunks. And on the top of the trunk they had an old mattress. And that's what they were sleeping on. So as soon as we found that out, we made arrangements so that they could have a real mattress. Now let me see, they had at that time this dear girl that we spoke about already, who had the misfortune of falling from a second-story house. She was the eldest girl, and her name was Alfredo. Now, her father's name was Alfredo. In Honduras, you'll know the feminine by the ending of the word. Alfreda means a girl. Alfredo means a boy. So they had some difficulty in giving her a name. At the first, I understand, as they were sure a boy was coming. But when a girl was coming, they just had to change the O to an A, and they were all right. So then they had Richie. Richie was the only boy. And then they had Ruthie, the three children. Now they, thank the Lord, had the privilege of going to a school that was run by a missionary. In fact, there was another mission there, but they were only in schoolwork. They came down with the idea of opening a school. They did not mean, I understand, to go along with missionary work, but eventually they got into that work to. However, these dear children had the privilege of going to that school, which indeed was a wonderful thing for them to help them along in their education. Now then, we were there for some little time, and we were able to help a little in the work. Don Alfredo had been at home for some time looking after a sick boy, but the sick boy had passed away, and now he was free, and he wanted to go out and visit some of his old friends and places that he had a custom of visiting times before. So I volunteered to stay at home and look after the meetings there, which indeed were very, very small at that time. However, we did that. But in the meantime, my wife and I had been looking around and found a better place to live in. So we rented this place and moved over there. And as time went on then, well, I had been desirous of visiting the Mosquito District. I had heard of it, but knew little about it. No one, in fact, seemed to know very much about it. But I had been interested in, as I already said, the Flattens District in Guatemala and the Mosquito District in Honduras, as these two districts were unevangelized. In fact, part of Honduras down there was unmapped and hadn't been properly inhabited. So I was much interested in that, as the Mosquito Indians lived down in that part. So we tried to find out how to get there. That was one place that Don Alfredo had not been, because, as I said, it was an uninhabited place for a long time, and even the authorities did not know much about it. So we were told we would have to go to Tegucigalpa, and there we would have to make our way from there to the Mosquito District. So Don Alfredo volunteered to go along with me. And at that time, well, the train that I've already spoken about from Puerto Cortes to San Pedro Sula went on still further to a place by the name of Puerto Rios, which was not very far. In fact, the whole line was about 60 miles or so from Puerto Cortes. So when we got to this place, Puerto Rios, well, we had to take a truck from there. It was called a baronesa. A baronesa, yeah, that was the name. Now that carried the mail going up to Gazalta, going up to Tegucigalpa. There was no railroad up in Tegucigalpa at that time, nor there is none even yet. However, that truck took us part of the way, that baronesa. And then we came to Lake Jehovah. Now there was no road round Lake Jehovah, so we were put on a boat large enough to carry this baronesa. And it took us about 2 hours or so to cross that lake. It was a quite big lake, very beautiful indeed. And we enjoyed, or at least I did, enjoy the trip along, as it was very peaceful. At the other end, the truck, the baronesa, was taken off that boat and then we made our way by road from there. Now, you wouldn't call it a road. However, it was possible. In fact, it was rather dangerous. Don Alfredo was a man who had faced many dangers, but one thing he did not like to do, and that was sit on the outside of the Baronesa. He would like to get into the middle so that he couldn't see. For sometimes, actually, one thought that they were going over the cliff, right down hundreds of feet below. In fact, many of those Baronesas and other trucks that were used to take the provisions up to the capital of the country, Tegucigalpa, went right over the cliff, and that was the end of all that was in that Baronesa or that truck, goods and everything else. So we made our way up, and it was rather beautiful, the country to look at. Well, in fact, there was many hairpin bends, and there was many places that you recrossed, one would think, going up the mountains, and you look back and you'd see your own dust that was coming. In fact, you're the dust that came from our Baronesa met us going up the hill. It had gone up before us by taking a shortcut